All right, welcome to Allen University. Today's subject will be talking about Chuck McGill. He is the main antagonist of Better Call Saul for its first three seasons, and he's probably, definitely the most hated character in the show, and probably the second most hated character in all of like the Breaking Bad universe, aside from like Skyler White, which we'll get into later on. But yeah, I've even met people in real life who hate Chuck even more than Skyler, and I always found that to be a little bit bizarre because even from the first viewing of Better Call Saul, I always thought Chuck was not only a more sympathetic character than Skyler, but also a more sympathetic character than most of the characters in his own show. But we'll get into that. So, in order to like organize the whole lesson for today, I will first be going over Chuck's mental illness. Then we'll be moving on to how this issue is handled in the show, like how is mental illness portrayed in the show, especially relating to Chuck. And then we'll eventually go on to like how does this change the show later on. So starting off with Chuck's mental illness, I think it's important to understand like what it is. So first, it's like he's allergic to electricity. He calls it EHS, where every time he's in the vicinity of electricity, he feels like very physical and like conditions that like hurt him. But other than the fact that he's supposedly allergic to electricity, there's also three other main characteristics that I think are pretty evident in his mental illness, and that those being it limits everyday function. This is very obvious. The world is filled with electricity, so he basically can't go outside. Basically, at the beginning of the first season, he's incapable of going outside. And even when he does start going outside, seeing the world, he's still limited in like the way that he still can't do things properly. Sometimes he wants to do something, but due to his illness, it can like limit him in terms of doing something that he wants to accomplish. We'll get into that also later on. But another thing I want to talk about is that his EHS symptoms, like other than electricity, the distress he feels when surrounded by electricity is also definitely linked to emotional distress. And what I mean by that is that I don't think his symptoms are solely triggered by electricity. I think electricity a lot of the time is an excuse or like something to blame instead of something else. And the reason why I say that is because like it's kind of evident in a lot of scenes in the show, especially like there's this date in Chicanery where he's with his wife. He's in a date with his ex-wife, and the cell phone starts to distress and like trigger his symptoms. But it's only really when he knows that the cell phone is there and that his ex-wife is talking to another man when he really starts to feel these symptoms, which could just be jealousy. And also, there's another instance where his last interaction with his brother, where he basically just coldly tells him that he doesn't love him. I find it very coincidental that after he says that, he basically unalives himself. So I do, and like also he experiences the worst of his symptoms, like the worst experience from his mental illness ever after that. So I do think other than electricity, emotional distress absolutely triggers a lot of the problems he has with his mental illness. And then I think the final thing I would like to point out is that he cannot control himself. Even when first of all, he doesn't even realize he has an illness, like a mental illness. Like he doesn't really even realize he has this condition until halfway through season 3. And even when he does recognize this, he is basically incapable of helping himself. He cannot get rid of this issue without mental health treatment or like having someone else check up on him. And this eventually leads to how like others in the show treat him. And that is that other characters in the show treat him pretty oddly. I would say like 95% of the characters who meet Chuck do not treat his condition like it's a mental illness. It's very bizarre. They treat it more like it's a physical disability. Like they work around it, they make accommodations. When he goes to work again, they just work around his illness instead of like trying to confront him about it. And like also they act as if his illness is unfixable, or like they either think it's they either treat it as if it's unfixable, or it would just be fixed miraculously if they just appease him for a while, which obviously doesn't work. And it's strange because the only other character in the show, like literally the only character in the show that recognizes the issue is his doctor, who recommends that Chuck get taken away for psychiatric assistance. However, in order to do this, she needs to have the consent of living relatives, which Chuck only has one, that being his brother Jimmy. Now, the problem with Jimmy is that he denies his treatment twice for Chuck. And this is where like the main issues of the show really start to arise, in that Jimmy is the only person that is capable of helping Chuck, but at the same time, he's also the least qualified person in doing so. And due to him just not understanding the issue or taking it seriously. So let's go over the times Jimmy does deny Chuck of this health care. And the first time, although it was the wrong decision, it's at least a little bit more excusable for some reasons I'll go down under with, and that is that, like, it's the first time Chuck has had an incident related to his illness. So at that point, Jimmy didn't really know that this stuff was going to be like recurring. And also another thing I'd like to talk about is that like Jimmy at this point didn't know that Chuck just absolutely despised him. So at this point, he's more interested in Chuck's interest, in that Chuck really does not want help. So at this point, Jimmy being more like courteousable to his brother, it makes sense. Like, it makes sense why he would want to respect that for Chuck. So this first incident where Chuck gets like in trouble because of his illness, although it's not the right decision that Jimmy denies Chuck of this health care, it at least makes sense, especially without like hindsight. So Jimmy gets a pass for this. However, the second time Chuck gets in trouble because of his illness, and Jimmy denies him of help, is probably like one of the worst decisions I've ever seen in fiction. So let's go over the reasons as to why this is such a bad decision. First of all, if Chuck was given help and like given psychiatric help, it would have secured Kim's job at Mesa Verde, because the whole situation and the whole reason why Chuck was like having these issues and like ended up getting hospitalized in the second season is because he wanted to find out the mystery of like how he lost Mesa Verde, like how his company lost Mesa Verde to Kim. So if they got rid of Chuck, who is the only one who's like really interested in finding out this whole thing, Kim's job would be secured, and as a result, that would also help Jimmy because it would help Jimmy's whole business partnership with Kim. So that would have been a huge benefit to Jimmy and like everyone else in the show. Second thing that would have been a benefit is that it would have gotten rid of a huge liability for Howard, and that's because by this point in the show, Chuck isn't really a good help for Howard's firm, because he's going out of line. He's doing some pretty bad mistakes. So even though Howard would probably be opposed to Chuck getting help at the beginning, long term it probably would have helped Howard's business, especially with hindsight, which these characters don't know. But anywho, even during the time, Jimmy getting Chuck help would hurt Howard initially. So Jimmy should probably do it anyways because he doesn't like Howard. But like anyways, next reason is that Jimmy doesn't have to deal with Chuck, and this would help Jimmy on multiple ways. First of all, it would help his reputation. He also wouldn't have this thorn on his side of Chuck always trying to like dog on him. So there's that. And then finally, the final point is that it gets Chuck the mental health care that he needs. So basically, Chuck ends up going down a path that is a lot better than the one he went down in the show. So now let's go over the reasons as to why Jimmy shouldn't give Chuck help, and the main reason why Jimmy didn't give Chuck help, that being that Chuck might hate Jimmy 2% less, since remember at this point in the show still, Chuck doesn't recognize he has a mental issue, and therefore he doesn't want to get help. So maybe if Jimmy didn't give Chuck help, Chuck would respect him a little bit more, which is just so dumb for multiple reasons. At this point in the show, Jimmy has done like something really horrible to Chuck. Jimmy has just been terrible to Chuck throughout the end of season 2. So him thinking that Chuck will hate him any less for not getting him the help he needs is just super stupid. Even without hindsight, this was a really dumb play. So this decision really only makes sense if you think like Jim, for only one reason, and that is that Jimmy just simply doesn't believe that mental health care would help Chuck. And this goes down probably the biggest issue for Jimmy, and that is that he just doesn't take mental health seriously. And that is what causes like most of the problems he has in the show. It's not that he's incapable of recognizing its importance, because like in season 4, he was even contemplating potentially getting therapy. And in season 6, he even recognized, in like the finale of the show, he basically recognizes he didn't help Chuck enough in terms of his mental illness. So he does have the capability of understanding this issue and helping others and helping himself with the knowledge of this issue, but he just chooses not to throughout the entirety of the series. He basically plays ignorance on this whole issue. And because of this, he's like way less of a sympathetic character, at least to me, because it's, in my opinion, it's hard to sympathize with a character who constantly makes their own issues and who constantly makes the wrong decisions willingly. Like he can definitely help himself and help others, but he just chooses not to. And I think that's a major issue with this character. And that kind of goes down with also like the whole feud between Jimmy and Chuck. And that is that, in my opinion, I think Jimmy is far more responsible in ending this feud between him and his brother than Chuck is, for multiple reasons. First reason is that he has more power than Chuck in their relationship. And the reason why I say that is because, yeah, sure, Chuck might have friends that can like get Jimmy's law license taken away, or like Chuck might have money. But halfway through the show, Jimmy also has money. And due to Chuck's mental illness, he's basically incapable of convincing his friends to do these favors on hurting Jimmy, because he's just, like, the mental illness aspect of his self is so pervasive to his life that it kind of alienates anyone around him. And that's really the main point, is that Jimmy has more power in this relationship for also another reason, and that is that the main reason is that Jimmy is a lot more mentally capable than Chuck. Because unlike Jimmy has, as I said before, the capacity to understand that Chuck is not an ordinary individual in the head. However, Chuck doesn't recognize he has this issue. He's not capable of controlling himself in this feud against Jimmy. He can't stop himself. So between these two characters, Jimmy should be the one who tries to like nullify all this, basically all the problems that Chuck gives him. And that's another thing I like to talk about is that also that Jimmy has less to lose than Chuck, in the way that Jimmy can handle failure a lot better than Chuck. For example, if Jimmy loses a job or he loses something that's important to him, he will either find a way to get back up or he can work around it. For example, when he loses his law license at the end of season 3, he can still survive and function in season 4. He's capable of getting back up. When Jimmy does something bad to Chuck unalives himself. Like, it's not an equal relationship when it comes to that. And because of that, I think Jimmy is very immature for trying to keep doing this like cat and mouse game with Chuck, because Jimmy is actually capable of like withstanding these hits that Chuck is throwing at him, while Chuck basically loses everything whenever he's like going up against Jimmy. And I think that it's very, very immature of Jimmy to just continue this fight and to keep going on as if there was no problem. So after all this, I want to go over like a few myths as to why, like a few myths surrounding Chuck's character due to a lot of sympathy towards Jimmy, which is incorrect, like, or at least it leads to muddled thinking, and we'll go over those right now with the first myth, and that is that Jimmy truly helped Chuck. This only really, again, like this kind of thinking only really makes sense if you think like Jimmy and pretend that like mental health doesn't exist. There is more to helping someone who's mentally ill than just providing them food and economic security. And also, Jimmy at the end of the show even like admits that he didn't help Chuck in the ways that Chuck needed to be helped in his final speech in the courtroom. So this whole point is kind of null and void. It's kind of stupid. So moving on to like the second myth, which I think is a little bit more interesting, and that is that Chuck is the main reason as to why Jimmy turned into Saul. And this myth I can understand a little bit more for multiple reasons. First of all, I think this myth exists because people want to find an excuse to hate Chuck. But even besides that point, people wanted to like make sense of why the show dedicated so much time to Chuck. It spent like 3 whole seasons to Chuck. So, and then also since the show is about like Jimmy turning into Saul Goodman, people just like naturally intuit that the screen time dedicated to Chuck must have something to do with Jimmy turning into Saul, which I can understand to a certain extent. However, under further evaluation, this myth kind of falls apart on its face. And the main things is that one, it takes away a lot of the responsibility Jimmy has and a lot of his horrible decision-making skills. And even if you were to play like the blame game on what other characters are more responsible for Jimmy turning into the dark side, there are numerous other characters, particularly Kim, who are far more responsible for Jimmy turning into Saul. And I can't go over every detail as to why these characters are like more responsible than Chuck or whatever, because it would take forever. But maybe in like a future video, I could go over as to why like characters like Kim and Mike were so impactful in Jimmy eventually taking on his final form in the show. So let's move on to at least like, how does this change the show? Why is there like so much hate for this character? So now that we've gathered like all this information for the show, like how do we make of it? And I think simply it comes down to just like comparing this character with another hated character created by Vince Gilligan, that being Skylar White, and that these shows are not as different as their audiences like to make them out to be, and this is especially true when like comparing these two characters, and that they're very, very, very similar, especially in terms of like their function in the show. Both characters are antagonistic to the main protagonists, those being like Walter and Jimmy. So there's that, and also I would like to point out that they're also in that. Well, I'll talk about this later, but they're also in that way a little unlikable since Walter and Jimmy are made out to be sympathetic from the very beginning. But also, I would have to say that both of these characters are very grounded. They distract from the fun parts of the show, which are like scheming and heists and drugs, and I think that can also be that's like another thing that they have in common. And also another thing I like to talk about is that both of these characters introduce themes of the show, which exist throughout the entirety of the show, but I guess these two characters are like the main embodiment of like, let's just say Skylar is like a pretty good example of like how themes of patriarchy relate to like Breaking Bad, and also with Chuck, same thing goes with mental illness. And I think this kind of relates to like why these characters are so hated in the show. For example, as I mentioned already earlier, characters like Walter and Jimmy are immediately made to be sympathetic and likable from the second they're introduced to the show. So making two characters that basically antagonize or like make them look bad and are basically antagonists to these characters kind of like makes them less likable in a lot of ways. Like it makes Skylar and Chuck less likable in those ways. And then these characters also distract from like the exciting drug heist parts of their respective shows by muddying the screen time with like thematic scenes. And I think that's something a lot of fans might not like. And also you have to think that since these are Walter and Jimmy are the protagonists of these shows, and they're the most well-known characters from these shows, they also attract an audience that is obviously going to be sympathetic to them. And these audiences are usually not going to be looking forward to scenes discussing about like morality and themes of like patriarchy and mental illness. Like these audiences just simply don't care about that, or at least don't want to think about that stuff. And as a result, these themes in the show of like patriarchy, misogyny, mental illness eventually get like pushed, like, or basically hidden in the show. Especially when you look at like discourse talking about the show, you don't have like a lot of content talking about these themes in the show, because frankly, to a lot of fans, they don't want to think about that stuff. They don't want to talk about that stuff. They'd rather talk about Walter blowing up a nursing home because that's so cool. But I would also say this kind of hiding these themes in these characters and like their importance in the show also is what creates myths for these respective characters. Since if you view Chuck without the context of his mental illness, you can just enjoy the cat and mouse games between Jimmy and Chuck without feeling bad or looking into any of the nuance that the show provides. Which eventually leads to, I guess, like, kind of the whole point, at least for Chuck's character in these shows, and that is that, similar to how misogyny and patriarchy are implicit themes in Breaking Bad throughout the through the character of Skylar White throughout the entire show, mental illness is an implicit theme in Better Call Saul through the character of Chuck. I think this is pretty obvious, but some people maybe need to know this. But I guess like going into the actual moral of the story, what I really want to go over is like, so what am I trying to get at? And I think the main point I'm trying to make is that Chuck is a very well-written character. He is a pretty accurate depiction of mental illness relative to other television series. And the way he's written plays with the morality of the audience and gets them thinking, which I think is kind of rare in a lot of television series. A lot of times you're just immediately meant to be sympathetic towards a mentally ill character. I think Chuck is a much more realistic example of how this is portrayed. And I think he's still sympathetic in spite of that. And another thing I want to talk about is also that, like, I think it's an interesting choice to make a character that usually would be sympathetic in most shows to be, and still is, like, sympathetic and relatively more moral than the main protagonist of the show, making him antagonistic and ultimately somehow making a character like this not liked in the community or not liked by people who watch him, which I think is pretty impressive. And I think these, and then like the next point I really want to make here is that, like, myth surrounding television series can sometimes cloud different perspectives and like discourse surrounding a piece of like fiction or media. And what I'm trying to get at is like I've noticed this specifically in like Better Call Saul community and like a lot of other in some other communities, but since this show kind of attracts the same people and like the same people don't really want to talk about Chuck and stuff like that, you eventually get a lot of like muddling down of the themes in the show, and you get a lot of repetition in terms of things that are talked about in the show. For example, there's not a lot of content on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet that talks about Chuck's importance in the show or him being a more moral character than Jimmy, because those things don't really have an audience and they're not really interesting to a lot of people because those things don't really align with what most people want to think about in the show. So eventually people just make myths about Chuck and they try to excuse why he's not as important to the show or like why they should be justified in hating him. And I think these myths really muddle down like the interesting parts of the show, which is talking about it and trying to like come up with an agreement. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I have future plans for other videos. For example, I'm planning on making why the Separatists were the good guys. I'm really looking forward to that. And also I want to talk about eventually like evolution of film criticism throughout the year, throughout like between the 2000 and 2025. I have a lot to say about that. But I think the first video I will have to make, and the first video that's warranted, is a Dune Imperium Uprising Bloodlines tier list. Because the only thing is that like the reason why I haven't released it yet is because I'm still trying to gather information. But when I'm done with that, I will release it. So thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Have a great day.